So the current week's assignments, obviously, we are looking at Abraham and Isaac, which we'll be talking about a little bit today. And so that's going to be a good fodder for online discussion. There is also a quiz this week, and we'll be able to talk in a little bit more informed way in the online discussion and the quiz based on what we talk about today. The Syrian Goddess, just to briefly summarize last week's reading, what do you think we can say about the Syrian Goddess, what the Syrian Goddess tells us about the way that the people in Syria are thinking about religion and their gods? Yeah.
Well, they clearly think that they can have a direct effect on what the gods think. Like the guy climbs up the obelisk to go talk to them. So they think that people are capable of having a direct connection with them.
And
in
through
certain places.
And through action, right? So through the things that you do and the way that you interact with the gods. You know, there's a sense of the book talked about the imminence of these Semitic gods. They're close by, and so not only are the gods active, but they're more responsive, I think, than we're used to seeing, right? Because we looked at the Hittite gods, for example, seem to be more remote, more inscrutable. It takes a lot of work to understand what the gods intend through multiple means of divination. They're more aloof and concerned with their own affairs. These Semitic gods seem to be present and engaged, and the people have to be too. So that's a good point. What else? What else comes up in the reading? Yeah.
Like sacrificing part of yourself to ensure a stable relationship.
Part of yourself, right? This came up a lot in the discussion. What is this about? Why is this a thing? What is the significance of this, do we think? Why is this the sacrificing? We're talking about castration. Why is this? And obviously, it's not the entire population. We have the select group of people who are pursuing a particular kind of priesthood. So what is this about? Why is this a thing for this particular? Yeah.
Because the method could be very cruel. The castration, like it might hurt and it might damage you. Mm-hmm. And by that time, you could get a sickness and die quickly.
Well, yeah, and there's the idea that this is something that you need to do, says something about expectations, right? The fact that you have to go to this extreme and perform this kind of action says something about the extremes of this is. It's already warm in here. It's noisy out there. It's a bad compromise. So other societies, we have sacrifice that's in terms of property. Here we have sacrifice that's in terms of identity. So that seems significant. That the Syrian gods are more demanding, more intent on ensuring that they have the right kind of follower. And this is relevant for us this week too, because this is part of the background. This Syro-Canaanite attitude toward the imminent gods and their demanding nature is part of the background for the Israelites and Judeans. What about this text itself? The text that we have, this particular author. Anything that we can say about that? Yeah.
He seemed a little bit he said he was from Syria.
Right.
And he seemed a little bit condescending, especially like in regards to the guy who climbed the obelisk. Like he completely discounted their local myth and tradition about the scorpion and chalked it down to him not wanting to fall off and die.
Right, and then he gives the sarcastic comment, so much for that.
So much for the guy who climbs the obelisk, yeah.
So this is a warning, to be aware of the means by which we have information about ancient societies and ancient religions. For religion in particular, we're getting this information from the perspective of people that are often from a different culture and have different understandings of how people interact with the gods. So there's a yeah. Go ahead.
At this time, was Assyria a really Hellenized place?
This document is from the 2nd century CE, so yes, Assyria would be part of the outer fringes of the Roman Empire, the Greek end of the Roman Empire. So, and Syria itself too was part of what's being talked about here. Is that this city of the goddess is separate from, distinct from, a throwback compared to the surrounding Hellenistic world. It seems to be rooted in past rituals and beliefs, and so sort of anachronistic. So what we have here is two things. One is we have this sort of patronizing viewpoint, where something that is not from the writer's perspective is a local curiosity, something to be viewed with sort of a jaundiced eye. And we get a lot of history that way from people like Herodotus, who talks about foreign cultures as anecdotes to illustrate the variety of human nature and the way foreigners are different from us Greeks. But we also get an attempt to do one of the things that's talked about in this week's reading, which is translation of gods. And I talked about this a little bit last time. This is called syncretism. The idea of one particular god being linked to the god of that you're familiar with. So in this particular case, we have this is a perfect example, because we have the author saying, this is the local version of Aphrodite. This particular goddess is not Aphrodite, isn't thought of as being another aspect of Aphrodite by the locals. Is not doesn't have the same name or personality or rituals or history as Aphrodite. So all that they have in common is that they're both goddesses of love and fertility. In other words, the way that this works is, the divine function is used as if it means they're the same entity, which all parties involved know that they're not. The most familiar example of this is when the Roman Empire expands to embrace the worlds of the Greeks. You start for the first time getting this talk about how, Zeus is really the same as Jupiter, which is so Zeus is the sky god of the Greeks, and Jupiter is the sky god of the Romans. And so you end up with these people talking about how, Zeus is another aspect of Jupiter, or that they're equated, that they're essentially the same god. And this is taken to even further extremes when, in the modern age, when you have modern translators of Greek texts who happen to prefer Roman history, and so they end up inserting the name Jupiter instead of Zeus in a story about Greek mythology. Just because the translator into English happens to think that they're the same and prefers to use the name Jupiter. So, but the story of Zeus is not the same as the story of Jupiter. The heritage, the legacy, the rituals, the presence of Jupiter in the city of Rome is a distinctive part of Roman history that is completely different from Zeus. All that they have in common is that they are both sky gods. And this becomes a way of trying to connect two different cultures that have, so that they seem to have more, trying to find commonality in cultures that have a great deal of difference. So this is something that happens more as under what circumstances would that happen? When would we get that, do you think? What would bring about the motive to do that What would cause that to happen? What would drive you to try to make these connections? Yeah.
For assimilating purposes, if you have another group coming in, you kind of want to make that cultural connection.
Right, and so assimilation, the idea of if you are taking control of a particular territory or trying to merge two different territories, you want them to develop a common sense of identity. Hey, we are really all the same, and we have the same focal point, the same purpose. And here's one demonstration. Your gods are really just like our gods. This happens with with missionary work, the spread of Christianity. It happens with the expansion of empires. We saw this with the Babylonian and Akkadian expansion into Sumer. How the early Akkadians liked the Sumerian gods and sort of merged their pantheon with the Sumerian pantheon. And so you have lists of gods that correspond to each other. The Kassites continued this. We saw this with the Hittites, where the Hittites developed this whole series of gods, and as they attempt to merge their cultures with the Hurrians and the other cultures, you develop a rubric of all of these, a matrix of gods that correspond to each other, all in an effort to create a common centralized identity, if possible. Is that a question?
And I was going to say another reason maybe. Could be for legitimacy purposes. So let's say you're like a nomadic people with not a really codified religion, and you invade Babylonia. You might adopt their religion to kind of give you more legitimacy as rulers and stuff like that.
Right, exactly. That's a good point. So, yeah, good.
I can get an example of that. When Alexander invaded Egypt, they proclaimed the son of Ammon, which is their version of Zeus, which is why they made him pharaoh.
Right, exactly. This provides legitimacy for Alexander, for political purposes. To be a pharaoh, he has to be a god, and he has to be an Egyptian god. And so they develop a descendancy from Ammon as mixed with the Greek pantheon. So, what's the bottom line then is that translation of gods between cultures happens for social and political purposes, for the purposes of consolidating identity and lending legitimacy. Anything else strike us as interesting about the Syrian goddess before we move on to today's topics? It's an interesting read just because it's a sort of instead of telling us a mythological story as we're getting for a lot of these readings, it's a sort of travelogue. So we get a visitor to a strange place talking from an external but informed perspective about how they see their gods. And in some ways, Lucian, the author of this, is fairly open-minded, even if he is occasionally patronizing, because he, at least from his own perspective, he's trying to understand. And one of the ways that he does that is by trying to connect the gods and the rituals that he sees there with things that he and his audience are familiar with. Yeah.
So were people at this time in that region, were they all kind of like believers in Greek mythology and lore? Because he said that the people of the city and himself kind of believed Dionysus founded the temple, and which is a Greek god, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, sort of. Dionysus is imported into the Greek pantheon from the East. So he actually has more of a connection to Anatolia and Mesopotamia than other Greek gods do.
So is this like a Hellenistic practice, or is this really local? Like, is this something that happened before Alexander the Great ever invaded?
No, this is happening, like I said, 2nd century CE, so this is, like 4 or 5 centuries after.
Oh, like, is this tradition
The
from
tradition.
that time?
The perspective that what happens with Hellenization is not so much that the Greek gods are imposed upon the lands that Alexander conquers. What Alexander the Great does in the 300s BCE is conquer a great deal of territory in Iran, Mesopotamia, Syro-Canaan, and Egypt. And as a result, why should I get mad at the students are talking? I should invite them in and ask them for their as a result, these territories are infused with Greek ideas and Greek stories and Greek perspectives. What he doesn't do is impose the Greek gods. So what the people of lands like Assyria, where Lucian comes from, have is familiarity with Greek stories and Greek literature. They would have known the Iliad and the Odyssey because that's how you learn Greek in the ancient world, by studying the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the Iliad and the Odyssey is full of Greek perspectives on the Greek gods. And so anybody in the Hellenistic world would be familiar with Greek stories and legends like, this particular god might have done this. And then they would use that as a frame of reference for talking about their own religion, as well as the religions of people that they encounter elsewhere. All right. So this is, like I said, this connects very nicely to our talk about the Israelites and the Judeans. So what's our first problem in studying the the stories of the Hebrews. Yeah.
There's no author, like, for any of the books. It doesn't, like...
Right, so we can't attribute the stories to one particular author. What else about these stories? We don't have a particular author to attribute them to, but even more than that, what about the nature of these stories? Yeah.
There's no time and place given? Or there's no time given?
For when the events happen? Yeah, so there's the actual chronology is murky, can be confused, and there's some reasons for this, because the versions that we have are actually mergers of different traditions that get brought together into a single set of documents, and those traditions are not necessarily consonant with each other. Even more than that, what about when these stories are written and the purpose for which they are written? Our study of Hebrew history comes mostly from documents that are much later, centuries later, and are written with the purpose of, what's the purpose of these documents? If we look at our history of the Hebrews, comes from the Hebrew Bible, from the Torah, the Old Testament. So, what's the purpose of these documents? Why were these documents actually written? Right? Yeah.
I guess that's as a history for the people, like a source of cultural pride, something that you can teach younger generations about.
Right, as a history for the Hebrew people, so that they understand who they are, and as a result of that, it's told in such a way as to reinforce the Hebrew identity, the Israeli Judean identity, and their relationship with Yahweh, with their God. And this means that the way these stories are told are designed to reinforce those cultural and religious purposes at the expense of objective history. And so, as we're trying to understand the story, we get a skewed perspective, and we don't have much in the way of additional evidence that's not from Hebrew religious texts. We don't have Egyptian evidence of the Exodus. We don't have literature and documents from the Phoenicians or the Canaanites or the Romans or any of the other rulers over these lands. What we're left with is just a single perspective that was deliberately designed for a purpose other than objective history. And so this is why the reading for today makes a point of saying we don't have evidence that there was an Exodus as is told in Genesis. Which is not to say that there isn't an element of truth in it, because we do know that there is an underclass of Semitic laborers in Egypt during the New Kingdom. And we do know that some of these were Hebrew tribes. And so there was a migration out of Canaan at the midpoint of the Bronze Age, when there were famines and crop shortages in Canaan. Egypt is always a land of plenty. It's designed in such a way that the geography is such that it always produces bumper crops of agriculture. And so there was a migration of Semitic peoples to Egypt during the Bronze Age that created this second class of laborers exploited by the Egyptians. And when the Egyptian kingdom falls apart and the Bronze Age collapses, there would have been a migration out of Egypt. And, you know, it's reasonable that some of these refugees would be making their way back to Canaan. So the problem is that this is mainly a speculation. You don't have evidence for it. Yeah.
So how did the Hebrews end up in Egypt in the first place?
They, you know, during a time of plague and famine in Canaan, there would have been a conscious decision by, you know, one tribe or a couple of tribes or whatever to seek better opportunities in Egypt, and so they would simply migrate across the Sinai to the Egyptian Delta.
And then also another question is it clear if they were actually enslaved or if they were just second-class citizens?
It's not clear. I mean, they're slaves in the sense that they don't have rights because they're not thought of as being Egyptian, and so they don't have participation in Egyptian society and culture. So, you know, they're an underclass of laborers, but
Were they chattel though?
yeah. So we can't go much further than that and say what the actual rules were, whether they had their own land and had to pay tribute, whether they were more like serfs or, you know, whether they were, you know, how they were treated. Because our only real evidence for that in terms of the Hebrews is coming from Genesis, and that's written much too late for us to have it, for it to be, you know, for it not to be distorted. The evidence that we have from the Egyptians is mostly the existence of Semitic workers. And a lot of that is visual in the form of tomb paintings, so it doesn't go into detail. So what we don't necessarily have is a official, you know, dramatic exodus. What we do have is a situation where a group of tribes that we can call the Hebrews is amassed. And amassed might be saying too much because it's probably not a very large group. You know, somewhere in the south of the Canaanites' territory. And so we know from the legend that they make contact with the Midians, and there's some scholarly speculation that the Midians might have originated the cult that the Hebrews embrace, which is a cult of the god El, who we've already encountered. We'll come back to that in a minute. So our territories here are at the end of the Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age. The Philistines have migrated into this territory from the outside. The Philistines are refugees from the Aegean world, called the Sea Peoples, and their descendants have transitioned to raiding and piratery, and finally they establish a base of operations here in what was originally part of the Egyptian Empire. As the Egyptian Empire collapses, and they help to make it collapse by fighting with the Egyptians, they take this territory for their own and create their own homeland, surrounded by Semitic peoples. The Philistines are an Indo-European people, and so they're seen as bizarre and alien. That's why our stories of the Philistines in the Bible depict them as so distinct and separate, because they are not like the people of the surrounding territories, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, and the Hebrews returning, trying to claim their land. Yeah.
So, in Exodus, God has the Jews take the long way around to avoid the Philistines. Is that just for religious purposes? Like they added that they made them take the long way around? Or was it actually because the Philistines were a big threat and they had maybe already defeated the Egyptians?
Right. The Philistines have in fact already had several wars with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians came off very badly in these wars. It helps to destabilize the Egyptian empire and bring the new kingdom down. And so the Philistines are more advanced technologically and militarily than the Egyptians or the Canaanites or the Hebrews, which is why, you know, who's the most famous Philistine that we get from the biblical stories? Yeah,
Goliath?
Goliath, who is depicted as a giant. And this is not because the Philistines were, you know, literally more massive, but because the Philistines were possessed of greater military might. And so, yes, if the Hebrews are fleeing from Egypt as refugees, they would have come around this way and would have made contact with peoples living in this part of. So it makes sense that there would be a surviving element of the legend that says that Moses made contact with the Midians. Yeah.
So if the Philistines were like more powerful than the Egyptians and all the civilizations of Egypt, what civilization like did they come from and stuff like that?
The originally they're from the Mycenaean Greek Empire. So they are, you know, when the Mycenaean Greeks collapse after the Trojan War, there's a great deal of fleeing from the Aegean because the economy has failed, and some of these are the people that become the Sea Peoples, and the Sea Peoples eventually end up taking this territory from the Egyptians and become known as the Philistines. So the result is that we have, instead of the version that we're more familiar with from the Judeo-Christian tradition, which says that Abraham, the founder of, or you know, the patriarch of the Hebrew peoples, chose to make a covenant with Yahweh and place no other gods before him. What this is actually describing is Abraham, or whoever was the original Hebrews collectively. But we can say Abraham for the purposes of simplicity, which is, you know, how legends get born. Let's just say it this way for simplicity. And 1,000 years later, that's what they're saying instead. Anyway, but Abraham embraced the king of the Canaanite, the Syro-Canaanite gods, who was El. And so we saw last time how the Phoenicians and the Canaanites and Syrians tend to have different versions of the same core of gods. Each city, you know, selects the gods out of the common set of deities that are important to them, and attaches their own stories to them. So they're the same gods, but they have their a subset is given special meaning to a particular city. So each city has its own version of the pantheon, and each city has its own pair of ruling gods. And so we saw in some cases that god, the male, lost track of where the wall was. We see that. See, I told you we had to have more comedy. We see that in some cases the Canaanite cities choose El as the male supreme god, but not usually. Even though El is the king of the Syro-Canaanite gods, Baal is more popular. I wonder why. Do we get anybody have any ideas as to why Baal might have been? I don't know. This isn't necessarily something that the readings talk about, but any speculation on why Baal might have been more more widespread, more popular, chosen by more cities. Yeah.
Could it be that he's more fierce, or in that sense destructive, kind of?
More feared, more destructive. Yeah.
I was gonna say, one wasn't he favored by the Phoenicians, which went all around the Mediterranean, so they would have spread it through trade and stuff, while El was more favored by the sedentary, the non-trading cities.
That's possible. Yeah, it could be more of a regional thing, and that would fit with where the Hebrews are originating to the south of Canaan. So. I think probably it's likely to be a combination of both, in that Baal, anybody remember what Baal is the god of?
All the gods, right?
Well, he's a particular divine role. Is the thunder, right? Baal is the thunderer. And so this is a much more tangible, much more in the real world, physically palpable God than someone like El, who is more conceptual. And because the Syro-Canaanite gods are already perceived as being imminent, as being right there and actively trying to impose their will upon their followers in dreams and through the actions of their kings. It makes sense that Baal would be perceived as being more present, more connected, a more reasonable choice, more fear. So the result is that there's a rivalry between the followers of El and the followers of Baal. And Abraham, or whoever, Abraham uses this as a means of forging a common identity out of this ragtag group of refugees that is coalescing to the south of Canaan. He's trying to form a nation, trying to form a shared social identity so that they can be strong enough to start to take back their lands. And so this seems to be the root of the identification between the Hebrew ethnic identity and a devotion to El, who becomes the prototype for the Hebrew God Yahweh. As the book says, this is not 100%, and this is not to the exclusion of other divinities, or even to remember that the Syro-Canaanite ruling gods come in pairs, and there's some evidence that there was a female consort along with El, but that this is being suppressed by the scriptures in order to focus upon the exclusive dominance of El. So the Abrahamites worshipped El. I forgot I had bullet points on this. The insistence on choosing El comes as a means of bringing about cultural transformation and unification. And this leads to an official cult. Once the Hebrews are able to take the city of Jerusalem, the El and the cult of El is given credit for the unity and strength that made that possible. And so therefore it becomes even stronger. The force of the cults becomes institutionalized, and the high priests are given a potency alongside of kings as the means of ensuring the survival of the Hebrew people. And so this is also reinforced with. We talked last week about how the Syro-Canaanites, because of the imminence of the gods, because the gods are so active and just behind the veil, the role of prophets, people speaking on behalf of the gods, becomes much more prominent in Canaan and Syria. This is even more true for the Hebrew cults of Jerusalem, with prophets being a means of reinforcing the teachings of the cults and keeping the people in line by castigating demons. Yes.
I know we covered this a little bit in like I think maybe the last class, the difference between like seers and prophets. But and like a seer is supposed to like they kind of go and do the work themselves. What would the Syrian augurs do? Someone who are talking to gods but through birds. Are those prophets or seers?
Well, see, that's the thing, is that this is a good point, which is that the nature of this cult is that they're not using divination. They're not using these ritualized techniques to try to discern the hidden messages of the gods, because the Hebrew God is shouting at them. The Hebrew God is telling them what they need to do through the priests, through the prophets, through the actions of the kings, and eventually through written text, which we'll talk about in a minute. So we don't have divination and an observation the way that we have for Hittites and other cultures, because the gods that are much less remote. So on our time frame, all of you probably saw this when I emailed it out. Hopefully that it was helpful. The result is we got a kingdom of Israel that is possible because the Bronze Age empires have collapsed and their armies are not marching up and down, saying in Syria and Canaan, trying to take territory from each other. Canaan is left to itself, and this means that the Hebrews are able to forge their own kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. And this kingdom is tremendously successful. It's able to expand its territory, and a temple is built, which is the wonder of all the lands. It's a temple in which Yahweh is said to reside, and it is meant to consolidate the Hebrew identity around the focal point of Jerusalem and the temple itself. But the surrounding empires don't remain dormant, and the Neo-Assyrians rise again, and the Assyrians, the new Assyrian Empire, the Iron Age, finds the kingdom of Israel to be a tremendous threat. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is built around exploitation of the lands that it rules over, its resources and its people, and crushing local identity, local traditions. The nature of the cult of Jerusalem is so strong that they perceive Israel to be a unique threat. And so by this time, the kingdom of Israel has divided in two. Solomon is the last leader of a unified Israel. After him, Israel is divided into a northern kingdom, kingdom of Israel, and a southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. Northern kingdom has more resources and is perceived to be more of a threat, and so at first Israel, the northern kingdom, is made to pay tribute. This is the king of Israel being forced to pay homage to the Syrian king. Finally, that's not enough, and the northern kingdom, many of its people are deported to Assyria, and they lose their lands and are forced to make new homes for themselves in Mesopotamia. And over the course of a few generations, these people are assimilated into Assyria and lost. The peoples of the northern kingdom are lost. And just to compound the injury, the Assyrians plant a set of colonists in the land of the northern kingdom that are alien to that territory, called Samaritans. And these end up being, they take all the lands that the Israelites of the northern kingdom had left behind. And so, as a result, we have the kingdom of Israel just comes to an end. And what's left is the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, which has resolved that this must never happen to them. And so, in the late period of the kingdom of Judah, we get more and more efforts at desperate reforms, trying to ensure that Judah is cohesive and singular. What's the nature of the text talks about the reforms of King Josiah? What's significant about these reforms? What are these reforms about? Yeah.
Tearing down other temples and trying to make the belief of Yahweh like the only.
Right. So part of what had happened is that the uniformity of the cult of Yahweh had eroded, and people were regressing to the worship of Baal and other gods. And so this is an effort to purge Judah of these contaminations so that it can be strong enough to withstand. And the other element is what? The other element of Josiah's reforms is the Deuteronomic nature of his changes, which is to say, what we're looking at here, under Josiah, the priests find in the back of the temple somewhere this book of the law, which is believed to be our book of Deuteronomy, or rather the book of Deuteronomy that survives in the Torah and the Judeo-Christian Bible. And this is a set of prescriptions for the behavior and the beliefs of the followers of Yahweh that must be adhered to. So the significance of this is what? Why is this so significant? Why is it so important that there should be a written text? Pagan religions don't have written texts. Yes?
It prevents it from changing, or it could help prevent it from changing.
Helps prevent it from changing, right? Because it's in a fixed form. There's no deviation. There's no questioning. There's no ambiguity. This is what the religious law is. What else? Yeah.
Everybody, no matter your status, is bound to it.
Right? So it's a means of creating uniformity across territory and across class, and making the covenant with Yahweh collective rather than individual. Which seems ironic, given these are prescriptions for individual actions. But as you say, the importance is that the community is bound to Yahweh. How is it significant for the future of the Jews? You notice that I haven't been saying Jews until now, because Jews refers to the people of the surviving kingdom only. Jews refers to the people of Judah. So how is it significant for what's going to happen to the Jews? How is it significant for the future? The impact of the emphasis on the book of the law becomes much greater after Josiah. Yes.
Well, does it kind of, since it kind of makes the community part of the covenant, like the covenant a community thing instead of an individual thing, does it kind of turn a religion into a nationality, almost?
Right. So right.
When they spread around and go all over the place,
Right.
they remain really distinct. They never assimilate into the societies they go into.
Right. It binds Yahweh to the community. It binds Yahweh to a set of words and ideas, as opposed to what are pagan gods bound to. Pagan gods are bound to the land, and so part of Josiah's reforms emphasizes Jerusalem and says that all sacrifices must be made at Jerusalem and this kind of thing, which is useful while the Jews are in Judah. But once they are deported, all sacrifices, verse of Paul suppressed, we talked about all this. Once the Jews are deported to Babylon, they can't take the temple with them. They can't take Judah with them, but they can take the words of the Torah with them. They can take the covenant with them, because the covenant is bound to the community. It makes, it allows for the reinforcement of the Jewish identity as a people, as an ethnicity, as a nation, as a religion, regardless of whether they are situated in the land that Yahweh/El comes from. Because Yahweh is no longer bound to the land. He's bound to the people. He's bound to the words that the Jews take with them when they are exiled to Babylon. Babylon arises as a new empire to replace Assyria, and it's a different kind of empire in that it is focused around the achievements of its culture, its engineers, its science, its architecture. It draws the minds and culture of the ancient world to it, so that it's thought of as being the great city, and it achieves dominance in this way, not through oppression, but through superiority that all agree upon. And as a result of this, they gain control over the lands that Assyria had ruled, and in general behaves in a more rational way, without oppression, reinforcing the security of the people who have their protection. The exception is the Jews, because the nature of Jewish identity is as great a threat to Babylon as Israel was to Assyria. And so, in this one instance, the Babylonians take a page out of the Assyrian book and deport the Jews to Babylon. This is not the entire population, but the major families, the larger property holders are uprooted from Judah and sent to Babylon, and the temple is destroyed, and Jerusalem it becomes is sort of left behind. And so, as a result of this, the large Jewish population is now situated in Babylonia, and because they saw what happened to the tribes of Israel who are assimilated and lost, they are determined to preserve their identity. They do this through through the consolidation of the law. And so they prevent assimilation by enforcing practices that had been incumbent only on priests, but that are now required of all citizens as a means of separating them from Babylonians surrounding them. And so these are things that are still part of Mosaic law today. The observation of the Sabbath, and the circumcision, dietary laws, and prevention of marrying outside of your community. All these things are designed to place a rigorous barrier between the Jewish identity and the Semitic peoples that are surrounding, the Babylonian peoples that are surrounding them. And it's successful because, they're there for 3 generations, essentially. There's, about 50 years in which they are in Babylonia and are able to preserve their ethnic and religious identity. And when they are allowed to return, when Babylon is conquered by the Iranians, by Cyrus the Great of Persia, Cyrus the Great sends them back to Judah because that's useful to him. Cyrus wants to conquer Egypt, and Judah would be a useful springboard, and so he allows the Jews to return to Judah and be, accept their gratitude. They build a second temple, and they enter this period in which the priest of the second temple is the most powerful person amongst the Jews. They're no longer independent. They don't have a king so much as a governor, and so authority is situated in the temple, and the book of the law becomes the laws of the people. It becomes a strictly enforced set of behaviors that punish any deviation. And as an example of this, we get the reforms of Ezra, the high priest, who during the time of the Second Temple enforces the miscegenation laws and orders all Jews to cast aside any Canaanite wives and their children, so that the purity of the Jews can be maintained. Why is purity such an issue, especially during the Second Temple period? Why do you think that the purity is such a significant factor in how these things proceed? Yeah.
Because that would affect their relationship with Yahweh. That's their key to establishing a relationship with Him against one another.
Right. Their whole identity is predicated on their covenant with Yahweh, and Yahweh is wrathful and jealous and is inclined to punishment. Yeah.
I think that another reason why purity was so important is because when more pure you are, more near to Yahweh you are.
Right. And this is the other side of it. You want to demonstrate that you are worthy. And so you have to undertake these actions that bring you closer. And that means the obvious thing would be the strictest possible adherence to the Mosaic laws and the Torah, everything that has been told to you. This also impacts on gender, because the Hebrews have a taboo about blood. It says that blood is a pollutant. And so this means that women are unable to participate in education and study of the Torah and so forth for certain days of the month, and so that means that they can't be present for all the teachings, and so this means that because the process of becoming a teacher, a rabbi, requires you to devote yourself, fully, every day for the duration of the period of the training. This means that women are excluded from teaching and progressively from being a part of the administration of the religion, and so therefore, because the religion is the center of the Jewish identity during this period, that means they're sidelined within Jewish culture in the public space. There's a great deal of importance in terms of what they do in the private space, but the nature of the enforcement of the law and the drive, the obsession of purity during the Second Temple period has a lot of secondary impacts. The Hellenistic conquests of the Southwest Asia under Alexander and his successors means that there's an influx of Greek influence which impacts upon the Jews during the Second Temple period and sort of divides the Jews into more devout, more devoted to the word of the law, and the more extreme of these are called the Pharisees, and those who are more influenced by Hellenism are seeking a more practical, more philosophical approach to Judaism. In some places, this leads to persecution of the devout, which, for reasons that are not totally clear, is taken up by the Seleucid emperor that is now ruling over Judah and Mesopotamia. The Seleucids being the Hellenistic Empire that was a part of Alexander's conquests in that part of the world. So the Seleucid king, who's now ruling over Judah, also takes up the persecution of the devout, mainly because the devout are more of a threat to the Seleucid identity, to the homogeneity of society. And this leads to an uprising under the Maccabees, which is a very long story, but although I need to say now is that it's successful and brings about a new kingdom, the Hasmonean kingdom, which is the last gasp of a independent Israel before the coming of the Romans. And so we see a lot of interesting things happen in the Hasmonean kingdom. One is that the law remains critical, but the prophets step it up a notch and become more extreme. And we get apocalyptic literature, which makes prophecies about the end of eras of history. In other words, we get stories like the book of Daniel that talks about a mysterious empire that will fall under certain circumstances because of the will of God, and so forth. And this is coded language for predicting the fall of the Seleucids. That all of this is temporary, and there will be a judgment, not just of communities, but of individuals who have performed evil, like, say, Antiochus IV, a Seleucid king who started the persecution of the devout, and so forth. So the prophetic literature becomes louder and more frantic during the period of the Second Temple. And so we have this very long period in which the Jews are ruled over by others, and finally we have increasing Hellenistic influence, and then the repression of the Seleucids under Antiochus IV, and then finally the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean kingdom, all of that is rendered moot by the arrival of the Romans, who are generally content to leave provinces as they are, but like the Assyrians, like the Babylonians, the Romans see the Jewish identity as a threat. The potency of the Jewish identity as a hindrance to assimilation and effective rule leads the Romans to engage in all-out war with the Jews. And this is one of the goriest and most heartbreaking wars in Roman history, the Jewish War of 66 to 70. And the result is that the Jews as a nation, as a political entity, are crushed, and the Second Temple is destroyed. And the Jews are left with only the Word of God as a means of perpetuating their cultural identity and preventing them from vanishing into history. And so the law becomes the primary means of relationship between community and God, and study of the law, education in the Scripture becomes essential to Jewish behavior in the ancient world. And this leads to the writing down not only of original Scripture, the bringing together an official canon of sacred texts, which becomes the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, the core of the Old Testament, but also a set of observations, elaborations upon the law, explaining how it works through rabbinical scholarship over centuries. And so these are enshrined as the Mishnah and the Talmud and other writings, means of interpreting and understanding the original books of law, further codifying Jewish belief. And so this is where the writing down of the story of Abraham and Isaac becomes so critical. The writing down of this legend is included in the book of Genesis as a means of telling a story about how one understands the relationship between the community of the Hebrews and the God Yahweh. And so, as you're reading Abraham and Isaac, think of it from that perspective. Also, think about it in terms of the background of Syro-Canaanites, of Semitic gods that we've been talking about. How much does the Hebrew religion, as we see it in a reading like this, have in common with the way we've been talking about the Canaanites and Phoenicians and Assyrians?
Yeah, it also shows that how important this particular event is, that it's in all three of the Abrahamic religions.
Right. Yeah, it's talked about. It's talked about amongst Christians. It's talked about amongst Muslims. It's seen as a crucial explanation, as a sort of a parable for how you understand faith and trust in Yahweh. So all of this is in the context of monotheism, the thing that emerges amongst the Jews. The book makes a big point of talking about two different kinds of monotheism, which are utterly different and incompatible with each other. So one of these is evolutionary monotheism. What is evolutionary monotheism? Yes.
There's one particular god that stands like head and shoulders above the rest, and it's supposed to be solely, like I'll give an example, like with the pharaoh Akhenaten.
Aken, yes.
Yeah, when he put the sun god, as above all the other gods, it's like that.
Right. Or we've also seen this with in Babylon with Marduk, and the text that we read, is talking about the 50 names of Marduk, the 100 names of Marduk. The idea of evolutionary monotheism is that it develops over time from a sense of one God becoming more important than the others. So I talked about the translation of gods between cultures as an aspect of this sense that this storm god and this storm god have something in common, and namely the fact that they're storm gods. They have different names and different traditions. They're different entities, but they're connected to each other. The Egyptians take that a step further through the hyphenation of gods. And so you have, the most familiar of these is Amun-Ra. Amun is a local version of the sun god, and Ra is the sort of abstract version that is shared across cultures. And so you're saying that this local version is an aspect of the more general version. The Greeks have a sense of this too. In their case, the example I was given in the book is Callisto, Artemis. You also see aspects of general gods like Athena Parthenos, the great temple in Athens, is dedicated to Athena, but to a particular Athena, Athena the Virgin, that is special to Athens. And the general pan-Hellenic version is what's important. It's most important that it's Athena, but it's localized also as well. And there are particular stories, particular meaning, particular rituals associated with it. So the hyphenation is a way of linking a set of local traditions with a broader cultural perspective. And this leads, as you say, to the idea that we were talking from the beginning about there being a divine world. So there's this single world, an association of gods that are in interaction with each other. And that's general to paganism. What happens with evolutionary monotheism is that you start to get the sense that thinking about the divine world as an entity itself, thinking of the gods collectively as acting upon the world and upon humankind. And one particular god is dominant amongst them, so much so that the actions of the collective are attributed to his dominance, even though there are hundreds of gods. Marduk, to take that example, is dominant over them, and so they act in accordance with Marduk's will. They act as an aspect, as an extension of Marduk. Even though there are all these different gods, they are an extension of the dominant god. So that you start to say, well, Enlil is Marduk in the form of acting as judge. And this has come to a sense of there being, a single super god. That essentially there's one deity that has many aspects. And so what happens under evolutionary monotheism is that local names and rituals are retained as a means of preserving local heritage. So you still adhere to your local traditions, but it's made part of a larger world. Evolutionary monotheism tends to bring about a cosmopolitan perspective, where you see your local traditions as part of a larger world of shared things in common. So this is evolutionary monotheism. What we have with the Jews is the opposite of that. We have revolutionary monotheism, which starts with the rejection of the beliefs of others, of saying what God is not, of saying what is not true. The point of all of this is that revolutionary monotheism brings about a truth which must be adhered to. You must choose. There's only one choice. This isn't like dualism where you have the choice between truth and falsehood. This is saying that there is only one choice. You must choose to embrace the covenant. And so, the difference between this and paganism tends to reinforce how you should act. But with monotheism, with revolutionary monotheism, what is enforced is what you must believe. And this is why, the deviation from this punished, and the scripture is so important. For the imposition of justice, the understanding of what it means to be devout, what it means to be faithful to God, comes not from testing what it is today through observation and divination, and seeing, what today's messages are from the God, and trying to figure it out from our own reason. It comes from the Word of God being told to you directly. This is what you must do. This is what God expects of you, and you must embrace this in return for God's blessing. And so this is why revolutionary monotheism requires Scripture, and pagan religions do not. The Scripture becomes the normative force because it is God speaking directly. And this becomes true for all monotheistic religions after this. And so, as you'll see, when we come to the Christians, this has a tremendous impact, and we'll be able to contrast this with the other pagan religions that we'll be exploring. So, I will leave you at that. Have a good week. Remember to post your comments on Abraham and Isaac. I'm looking forward to discussing all that with you. Don't forget to take your quiz by Sunday, and I will see you next week.